Part 23. I Miss My Mother. I did not know why my father bothered my mother until I was more than 50 years old. I could not have known my parents' past, but I think I was not interested in family matters until then. I was not an undutiful son, but I feel like I was unfaithful to my mother. My mother used to be reticent and did not look uncomfortable, especially when trying to tell her children the good news. Later, after both of my parents died, my wife told me what she had heard from my mother. My wife said that my father's doubt toward my mother began during the Korean War. I would like to put this event aside as the submachine incident. The effects of the incident went on for more than 50 years, and it still remains a scar on my family's heart. When I found out about this fact, I bitterly resented the Korean War. If the war had not occurred in our country, there would have been no pain from the separation, no hunger, and especially no submachine incident. My father was diagnosed with bladder cancer more than 20 years ago. We thought it was nothing but inflammation, but it was late-stage bladder cancer. The doctor said the entire wall of his bladder had become cancerous and had to be removed. My father was admitted to a general hospital in Yoido for a bladder removal operation. Early in the morning on the day of the surgery, my father took off all of his patient clothes and laid down on a hospital bed. He could not keep his hands and feet together properly. He also looked stiff all over with fear, rather than lack of strength. My sister cried when the nurse pushed the bed into the elevator. He broke my family's heart all my life, and I did not even want to see him. But I feel sorry for him in this situation. I used to cry more than others, but I did not cry at the hospital. My father is paying for torturing my mother. I have no reason to cry. A doctor in a green operating gown walked out of the operating room and called us. It's worse than expected. We need to completely remove his bladder. We're going to cut out some of his small intestines to make a urine tube that connects his kidneys to the right side of his abdomen for his urine discharge. The doctor said he could not urinate normally and had to carry a urine bag on his side. When I heard the doctor's explanation, my eyes suddenly went dark. Can he put up with his shabby self and his impatient personality? What if he says he would rather die and blame me? Although I had mixed ideas, I still decided to save my father's life. The doctor went back into the operation room and it took 11 hours to do the surgery. Right after the surgery, my wife asked me to buy some abalones that were good food for surgical patients. What good has he done? Should we even buy abalones for him? My mother spoke disapprovingly, but wiped the tears from her eyes. I looked around the neighborhood market with my wife, but I could not buy abalones because it was winter. We searched all the shops in the Norongjin Fisheries Market, Seoul, and managed to buy some abalones. My father had to live with an artificial bladder, like a plastic bag. He had to replace the artificial bladder once a week, but he could not do it alone for a long time, being it after surgery. I was in charge of buying the artificial bladder and replacing it at that time. A few months after the surgery, the wound healed, and he adapted to his appearance. Perhaps because of the idea of being an inoperable cripple, my father still tormented my mother without getting drunk. One day, when I came home from work, my mother was nowhere to be seen. I thought she would be back in a couple of days. My father suspected that I had taken my mother somewhere. I waited 3 days, but she did not come back. I did not hear from her for a few more days. I reported this to the police station and waited for any news, but I heard nothing from her. My mother seemed to have made her mind at that time and left home. With all the children married, she seemed to have left thinking that she had done her job as a parent. I put up with it for you. If my youngest gets married, I'll disappear without a clue. My wife cried, saying that my mother usually said this. My close relatives always told me that my mother was so patient. They also said that because my mother put up with it, my family maintained until then. 20 years ago, one of my relatives passed away at the young age of 40. One day when he was drunk, he grabbed me and complained, "If I had someone like your mother, I would not have such a hard life." My mother was such a great person. I could not understand why my father had to live in doubt and torment her. The war ended a long time ago, and his children could live well. Why would he make his own problems and suffer in them? I could not understand him. If he had shed his own hard past and designed his life anew, how good could it be? I was frustrated at the thought. Yet, my father got worse and worse as he got older. I went around with my wife looking for a place where my mother might be. One Sunday, I visited my mother's sister's house in Ganghwa and Gimpo. Another day, I visited my maternal cousin, whom I had not seen for a long time. No one knew anything of my mother's whereabouts. My father still doubted me. While my mother was away, my father cried and hung on my wife. I finally found out that my mother was at someone's house. My father promised not to bully my mother again, and she returned home after a few months. After my father had surgery for cancer, he would hardly ever drink. One day my father called me. "I found a workroom in Bucheon. There is also a living room, so I signed a lease. I'm going to live apart from you, all right?" I could not figure out the reason why he suddenly wanted to move away. I worried about my mother, so I opposed my father's plan, but he eventually left for Bucheon, a place far from home. He seemed to think that if he moved away on his own terms, he could live quietly with my mother. My mother did not want to live separately, but she did not want to be a burden to me and my wife, so she seemed to follow my father. Meanwhile, my mother seemed to have suffered from comparing herself to my wife, who was free to socialize. Unfortunately, not long after my parents started living separately, they passed away. I resent myself for not being able to stop my parents from moving. During the funeral, the church minister and saints came to worship. I could not sing along with the chant because I was choked up with tears. A few years before my father's death, the government's veteran system expanded so the KLO soldiers could be buried or enshrined in the National Cemetery as veterans of the Korean War. It may be an honor for the bereaved family to bury him in the National Cemetery, but I took him to Donghwa Gyeongmo Park in Paju, near where his hometown was, as he hoped. The park is located near Tongil Dongsan Unification Theme Park and the Unification Observatory in Paju, the northern part of South Korea. More than 20 years ago, the Donghwa Gyeongmo Park was built by the Governmental Committee for the 5 northern Korean provinces and was sold to refugees from the north at a reasonable price. My father paid 2 million won for the graveyard in the park himself. The park was divided into districts of Hamgyong, Pyongan, Hwanghae, and unrecovered provinces. My parents settled down in a district with other displaced people from their hometown of Gaesong. It's a pity that both of my parents died without going to the hometown they had missed all their lives. I also planned to go to Gaesong with my parents when the tour started. My father used to sing songs to soothe the pain of losing his hometown. One of his favorite songs has the following lyrics: "I miss my hometown, but I can't go. My mother only had a longing for home. She did not have a popular song to sing. She could sing a Japanese children's song that she sang during the Japanese colonial era. The lyrics of the song that my mother used to sing begins as follows: Momodara-san, Momodara-san. I still don't understand the meaning of the song's lyrics. My mother lived for her children, having no time to pay attention to popular songs. She devoted a lot of her soul to me, the eldest son in the family, and relied on me. She seemed to think that I, the eldest son, would create an opportunity to escape from poverty. My father had the same idea. It is said that you cannot make something out of nothing, but my parents had nothing to lean on in the country because they had fled from their North Korean homeland. My father did not order anything special for me, but he often said that if the eldest son did good, the younger brothers would do well too. I grew up with a sense of responsibility that I should step up to make my family feel like decent human beings. There were too many people around us who had sad stories. Some people were forced to abandon their children. Many people had separated themselves from their families since the war. From my mother's point of view, she had as much of a heartbreaking story as anyone, but she never abandoned my family. She lived patiently for her children, enduring her husband's abuse. I don't know if such a life could be considered a so-called woman's life. She had lived her life for her family rather than her own happiness. My mother went to get meals when her children were hungry, and even though my family had no money, she tried to send her children to school. Since my father quit his business due to the development of the Nakwon market, she carried around a large rubber bowl and sold red pepper powder at one time. When my father and mother quarreled, he would upset the large rubber bowl in the middle of the market. The red pepper powder in the large bowl was a source of business and a means of livelihood for our family. The pile of red pepper on the street always haunts me. When I think of it, I even shed tears. When it was time to prepare for winter, she picked up cabbage leaves and radish leaves on the market and made kimchi, fermented vegetables. My mother always had to borrow money when my family needed it. Even though my family was poor and in need, she asked me to have good table manners. Most of all, my mother tried to hide everything from my father so as not to hurt me. I did not return anything to my mother. I am heartbroken when I think of not protecting her to the end. I could not sleep for a few days after she passed away. If our country had not been divided into the South and North Korea, there would have been no such pain. Thinking how happy we would have been without the Korean War. I resent the leader of that era for failing to protect our country. One night I could not sleep. I could see the words of the Bible frame on the wall while laying in bed. It was a gift from my colleague a few years prior to congratulate me on my appointment as a deacon. It was Psalms 23:1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I did not quite know the meaning when I hung it on the wall. I had been going to church for a long time, but at that time I did not think deeply about the words. I read it over and over again, and I finally understood the meaning clearly. The shepherd is the keeper of the flock. I myself am the sheep, and the shepherd is the one who keeps everything. So I need to leave everything to the Lord. When I could not fall asleep after that day, I closed my eyes and memorized these words in my mind, and I slipped into a sleep without realizing it. I was amazed. I fell asleep as easily as if I had taken a sleeping pill. I still recite Psalms 23:1 when I can't sleep because my mind is racing.